So, as I said, this modern slavery is a top priority for the UK government and for our Prime Minister. As many of you will know, we, in 2015, created the Modern Slavery Act, which is, for the first time, places a requirement on large businesses to produce annual statements on what they are doing to control forced labour and modern slavery in their businesses and supply chains. And this landmark legislation has resulted in thousands of transparency statements being published. Could we change the slide, please? So just to understand the kind of wider international context, in 2017, our Prime Minister, Theresa May, who was seeking to advocate for a coordinated international response to tackling modern slavery, launched the call to action to end forced labour, modern slavery, and human trafficking. So this is a non-legally binding document, but a political statement of intent that has been endorsed by over 88 countries. Many of the member states will be in the room today, and we have been very grateful for the continued international support to kind of tackle this and make sure it's on the international agenda. It sets out the practical steps that countries should be doing to respond to modern slavery within their countries, but also to fulfill the commitments that have been agreed by international community through existing conventions, international processes, etc. But there are specific themes that we draw out from the call to action. So eliminating modern slavery from our economies is a central theme, alongside building the evidence and research, reducing vulnerabilities, increasing victim support and resourcing, and basically boosting the international resource to tackle this agenda. So in terms of our efforts with the private sector to do work on this agenda, we also, alongside the governments of New Zealand and Australia, Canada, and the US, last year at UNGA, launched a set of international principles to tackle exploitation in supply chains. Sorry, could we change the slide? So this is it here. And this is basically in recognition that we have seen sustained progress, I think, from the business community to want to do more on this, to understand how to apply the UN guiding principles and understand the crucial role that they play in alleviating poverty, but also to recognise that governance also play a crucial role, not just the private sector, in tackling supply chains. And just the key point to make here is, I think, when developing these principles, we found the kind of key message here is that actually the combined central government spend of those countries, so that's Australia, Canada, New Zealand, UK and US, on public procurement was more than $600 billion in 2017. So that is an indication of the key roles that government play in implementing measures that can drive more effective and sustainable procurement practices. And the four principles are to take steps to prevent and address trafficking in government procurement practices, encourage the private sector to prevent human trafficking in supply chains, specifically looking at responsible recruitment policies and practices, and to strive for harmonization across countries. So could we change the slide, please? So what I wanted to do here was just give you an overview of the range of partners we work with on this particular agenda, specifically looking at what we do with the private sector to prevent and address trafficking in supply chains. And this is very much based on a kind of framework of investing in decent work, so thinking about tackling the SDGs and stimulating inclusive growth that transforms economies. And so our recognition is from the private sector that, as I said before, to understand what they need to do in order to comply with the principles, but also to give them practical tools that can help them carry out their due diligence duties. So just some of the examples. So we have the Ethical Trading Initiative, and Cindy, you'll hear from her later today about some of the work that they do. We work really closely, obviously, with Alliance 8.7. Some of the more innovative work that we've done through our Responsible Business Programme is with Humanity United, which works very specifically on tech solutions to tackle trafficking in supply chains. And that's looking at stuff like supply chains mapping, worker voice platforms, and particularly ethical recruitment. And then another key theme of the call to action was also looking at research and evidence. So what do we understand about the issues that are happening, particularly in the lower tiers of supply chains, and how can we address that? And then the other, sorry, could we change the slides? And then just to say, I think there's an important message here about investors, particularly how we work with kind of developing financing institutions to improve safeguards on modern slavery and child labour. And part of our work on this, we developed a guidance note, and that's for investors and private sector companies to kind of look at their environmental and social due diligence practices, and which would complement existing guidance, so the OECD guidelines, UN guiding principles, ILO conventions, etc. And this is just some of the stuff that is covered in this guidance note, which is available online, so I would encourage everybody to have a look at it. And basically, the key message here is that we want to build the toolbox for companies to be able to use to act and operate more responsibly, but recognizing that it can't be done in isolation, and that we need the workers, we need the employer groups, and we need governments to actually take active steps to do more on this. So I'm just going to hand over to Farid now, who will tell you a bit more about the other principles and some of the work that we're doing in this space.
Thank you, Lucy. Can we change to the next slide, please? So I'm going to talk a bit about how we're implementing the 4 principles that Lucy mentioned earlier today in the UK domestically with the businesses operating in the UK, and what they're doing to tackle modern slavery, forced labour in their global supply chains. So yeah, we've got this legislation that requires about 17,000 businesses to produce annual statements detailing the steps they're taking to tackle slavery in their supply chains. And the idea behind this legislation is that it will create sort of internal and external drivers to make and encourage businesses to take action. So the internal drivers are that senior business leaders within these organizations are required to sign off the statements. So a CEO or the board of directors will need to approve it and sign off. So we know that whatever the company is saying has been considered at the highest level within that business. And we think that's important because senior leaders within any organization are important to making sustained and long-term change. And obviously, because the statements are available online, it creates external pressure from media and civil society and investors to look at these statements and put pressure on companies to take action. So that's the thinking behind the legislation. In terms of the government's role here, we've found that it's been quite important to directly engage businesses as well, and that it's not only for sort of other actors to be holding companies to account, but for us to make sure businesses are thinking about the legislation and actually implementing the spirit of the legislation, which is to conduct due diligence in your supply chains. So that's why we've wrote to 17,000 companies directly to the CEOs, telling them that it's important to be complying with this legislation, and if they do not, there's a risk of them being publicly named online. And yeah, so it's been enforced for a couple of years now. The legislation was introduced in 2015. We've had a couple of years to reflect on how it's been going. And one of the things that we're doing to sort of consider how we can improve our approach to transparency is we've commissioned an independent review of the Modern Slavery Act in its entirety. And one of the key focus areas is this transparency in supply chains regulations. So recognizing that what we did in 2015 and now in 2019, there are definitely lessons to learn, and I'll be more than happy to share that with everyone afterwards as well. But thinking about how we can make sure that our approach to engaging businesses is right and is evolving over time. So we're considering the review, the independent review's recommendations, and we'll be responding in due course. Can we go to the next slide, please? But as we've got this legislation that requires businesses to take action, the first thing businesses say is, what is government itself doing to tackle modern slavery and forced labour in the stuff that we purchase? And that's why we think this is a really important priority for us now and moving forward, is how we can leverage and harness the government spending power that we have, and also the rest of the countries that have endorsed the principles, to drive better standards in the private sector. We in the UK spend about 47 billion a year through central government, So that's £47 billion. So that's stuff that central government has, direct control over. And then the wider public sector, so like, schools and health and all that, the rest of it, there's about 200 billion. So that wider public sector spends a lot of money. And, I think we all in government have a duty to spend public money in the right way. And one thing that's really important for us is to make sure that we're not inadvertently creating demand for slavery by the way that we purchase, and not taking reasonable steps to make sure that we contract with the right suppliers who are taking meaningful steps in their supply chains. So we are, the Prime Minister announced at the G20 that we'll be publishing a statement ourselves later this year, which will detail the steps that we're taking as government to tackle modern slavery in our supply chains. And the big priority for us at the moment is trying to upskill central government and procurement staff within the public sector, because it's a new challenge for them. So we've launched a couple of tools to help them. So we've launched a modern slavery assessment tool, which is freely available to all of the UK public sector. Essentially, it's something that we want them to use with their suppliers to better understand where risks are, and then to give them tailored recommendations on how to improve, trying to make it as accessible as possible, because this stuff is new to a lot of people and it's complicated, but it's the first time that the public sector is really engaging with this, so we need to make it as easy as possible for them and support them as much as we can. We refreshed e-learning, which is obviously a core component of upskilling organizations to take steps. And we also held a conference quite recently with the Ethical Trading Initiative and the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe to get international stakeholders all in one room, procurement people and human trafficking policy people in the same room to talk about how we can actually tackle this in a more collaborative way across different professions. The other principle I wanted to quickly touch base on is responsible recruitment. We know debt bondage is a particularly important issue in addressing forced labour, and we know that the recruitment process is a key point to intervene in. So we're piloting some innovative projects at the moment. We've got a project with Anti-Slavery International in Mauritius to help improve the working conditions of migrant workers, and we've got an existing project in South Africa with together, and we're about to look into piloting a responsible recruitment project in Southeast Asia, looking specifically at the rubber gloves industry. So if anyone has an interest in that, I'll be happy to talk to you afterwards. But the idea is that we want to be piloting projects to help actually find concrete solutions that work on the ground. So just to sort of summarize, in terms of the key lessons that we feel we've got from our approach to tackling forced labour in supply chains is sort of threefold. So the first thing is our approach. We've learned that we really need to have different teams in different organisations to be working together. It can't really be something that sits in a business only in the corporate social responsibility team or just in the procurement team. It needs a cross-organisation approach to be effective. And also for a lot of businesses and commercial staff, this is a new work, it's a new policy challenge. So making it as accessible as possible, and that's really what we've tried to do with the modern slavery assessment tools, make it very accessible for public sector organisations and their suppliers to use it and to understand where risks may be. The other thing that's quite important in our general approach that we've learned is external collaboration. So that's working with civil society organisations, working with experts, working with businesses, because we don't have all the answers. And obviously, when you work with these types of organisations, you're able to do a lot more with a lot less resources. So yeah, I think in our approach, I think those are three key lessons. In the action that we take as government buyers, but also as businesses, is to take a long-term staged approach. Identify where your priorities are and take targeted action there. It's not easy doing this work. I've been doing it more and more in public procurement over the last year or so. It's a massive challenge, and it can be quite scary at the beginning, saying, okay, we're supposed to understand all of this, but really you need to just take a step back and think about where can I have the biggest impact and who can I work with to help me have to have that impact. And obviously thinking about how you're going to evaluate your action. A lot of action that businesses and governments are taking is fairly new. So it's thinking early on, how can we make sure that whatever we do, we're building in an evaluation process to make sure what we're doing actually has an impact on the workers right down the supply chain. And I guess the final sort of lesson for us, and I guess this underpins all of our work, is the idea of transparency. So that's transparency in your supply chains, transparency in understanding how your workers are being paid, transparency in everything, and then also being transparent about what you've done. I think that's really important to help make sure that you, as an organisation, improve, or as a government, improve year on year. There's basic things that we can all do regardless of our level. Things like requiring transparency in contracts. Thinking about how the price that you're setting when you're purchasing, will that affect how can that potentially have a negative impact on workers down the supply chain. I think there's some basic stuff that, regardless of where an organisation or a government is in their journey, can all do. But yeah, me and Lucy are happy to talk about any of this in the margins as well. Thank you very much.